Good day. Today is Wednesday, 21st May 2025, and this is my last video, my last program, which I'm making in Russia before I fly back to the UK. In fact, I am making this video against a particularly tight program, so I'm afraid this video is going to be especially brief, even more brief than some of the videos I have been making other times during my trip. But there are some important things to discuss, and I think it's a good moment to do so before I leave. Briefly, I think the most important piece of news over the last 24 hours has taken place here in St. Petersburg, in precisely the forum which I have been attending, the legal forum which I have been attending, which has been addressed by the Vice Chairman of Russia's Security Council and former President and Prime Minister of Russia, Dmitri Medvedev. Now, before I continue, I should quickly say that Mr. Medvedev, Dmitri Medvedev, is, as well as being, as I said, former President and Prime Minister of Russia, he is, by universal acknowledgement here, an extremely capable and successful lawyer. He has absolutely very much of a legal background. And though I haven't discussed the fact with anybody here at this forum, I have heard it said previously that he's the sort of person who might easily one day become himself a member of the Constitutional Court of Russia, which is the institution which has played a key role in inviting me. So it is entirely appropriate that Medvedev, as a lawyer, would attend a legal forum in St. Petersburg. But of course, he is also Vice Chairman of Russia's Security Council and head of Russia's Military Industrial Commission. And he has been, well, to say it straightforwardly, very outspoken for the last 3 years on the whole conflict in Ukraine and on Ukrainian affairs. And, well, there are various different ways of interpreting the role that Medvedev has played. He could be someone who has acted as a kind of hard cop to Putin's soft cop over the course of the last 3 years. He has taken a consistently and visibly harder line on the Ukrainian conflict than Putin in his public statements has done. Or, and this is not inconsistent with Russian history, it may be that he represents the opinion of those people in the Security Council who believe that Russia should be taking a harder line, and that what has happened in the context of some of the things that Medvedev said at this forum, that there's been some kind of agreement reached between that hardline faction and Putin, and that Medvedev's words reflect this. I'm not going to explore any of this further. I have somebody who frankly does not believe that it's either proper or wise for outsiders to spend too much time debating and discussing these internal issues. There is a whole industry of people who dwell and spend time on them. And there has been, for as long as I can remember, people who follow Russian events and who try to understand the different currents of opinion within the Kremlin. All I would say is, in my opinion, in my experience, those people almost always get it wrong, and I don't think it's worthwhile my debating it further. But anyway, one way or the other, Medvedev is a very important voice in Russian politics and in Russian policy on Ukraine. and either because he's setting out an agreed position of the entire Russian government involving Putin, which has been there all along, or because he reflects an agreement that has been reached within the Kremlin. What he had to say at this legal forum was extremely important. Now, he discussed many things, but I will focus on what he said about Ukraine. And briefly, what he said, and he spoke unequivocally, is that these negotiations that are underway now are Ukraine's last chance. He said if Ukraine wants to preserve its statehood or remain even some kind of state entity, he was very skeptical, to put it mildly, about the reality of Ukraine's current statehood, calling into question the extent to which Ukraine really is a sovereign country, instead of being just, shall we say, a vassal of the West. Anyway, to the extent that Ukraine is a sovereign country, to the extent that it retains an identity as a country, these negotiations that are now underway between Russia and Ukraine, the direct negotiations that Zelensky resisted for so long and has sought to outlaw, are Ukraine's last chance. If these negotiations fail, then Russia will move towards basically demanding unconditional surrender. And that might call into question Ukraine's continued survival as an independent, sovereign entity. Now, these are very, very harsh words, to put it mildly. And they are not, they're not inconsistent with things that Medvedev has said in the past. But the way in which he said them, the fact that he was now talking about Ukraine having one last chance, which are these negotiations, seem to me to reflect a consensus, however it's been reached, in the Kremlin, in the highest levels of the Russian government. And this warning should be taken in Kiev and in the West extremely seriously. The point to make is that Medvedev's warning is one that the Russians are in a position to see through. There's been a huge amount of commentary and discussion in parts of the Western media subsequent to the conversation between Putin and Trump about why does Trump not put more pressure on Putin? Why, when they meet, does he always, in effect, go with the flow, Putin's flow, instead of putting pressure on Putin? With the implication being, why does he not impose massive sanctions upon Russia? The bone-crunching sanctions that Lindsey Graham has been talking about. Well, here, in fact, we've had some really useful clarity and explanation from none other than Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, who actually discussed all of this with Congress and had to field all sorts of questions from various unfriendly people in Congress who, to be straightforward about it, just don't seem to get it. It was actually a very interesting discussion. Rubio made exactly a point that I have made on these programs, that imposing sanctions of that kind on Russia now would, in terms of the Ukraine conflict, be completely counterproductive. It would solidify Russian determination to see the war through and to achieve a military solution. It would end Russia's hopes that some kind of rapprochement and understanding could be reached with the United States. It would destroy US-Russia relations, and it would end any hope for a negotiated solution to the war. That is what Rubio said. And of course, he is absolutely right. What Rubio did not say, and what no US official wants to say, is that these sanctions, which have been imposed on Russia, would fail. It is a very difficult thing, I think, for American officials to openly admit as much, to come along to Congress, to tell the American people, to share with the rest of the West, to share with the rest of the world, that one reason why America is holding back from sanctions, the bone-crunching sanctions, is that they would not achieve the result that those who advocate them expect that they would achieve. Russia has survived any number of sanctions since they first started to be imposed in 2014. Every one of these rounds of sanctions have been hailed by their advocates as the sanctions that would break Russia. I remember when the sectoral sanctions were imposed in July 2014, that it was expected that they would lead to the stagnation of the Russian economy and economic collapse. And I also remember that at that time, the German intelligence agency, the BND, was advising Angela Merkel, who had somewhat hesitatingly supported these sanctions, that the sanctions would create uproar and crisis within the highest levels of the Russian political system, which according to BND were the so-called oligarchs, the business people who it was taken for granted in Western commentary at that time were the true leaders of Russia, and they would tell Putin, unless he made peace with the West, unless he ended the conflict in Ukraine on Western terms, and did so within a few months, then he would cease to be president of Russia. I remember thinking that this was extraordinarily wrong, a profound misunderstanding of Russian political and economic realities. I wrote and said that at the time, but I can well remember that that was said back in 2014. And then, of course, there have been further rounds of sanctions. Since there was an all-out sanctions attack in February 2022, the Biden administration, I remember, was saying that these would be the sanctions taken to the highest level. I remember a US administration official, in other words, a Biden administration official, saying in February 2022, before the special military operation began, that if the Russians did launch an invasion of Ukraine, the United States would impose sanctions. It would go, this time, unlike previous occasions, to the very highest level of sanctions imaginable, and it would stay there. Previous sanctions had been weak, and this time it would be different. Biden, unlike Obama, believed that sanctions should be put at the very toughest, most stringent level imaginable, and that was the way to bring the Russians back into line. And in fact, we did get ferocious sanctions imposed in February 2022. Russia was disconnected from SWIFT. The central bank reserves in the West were frozen. There was an all-out economic attack on Russia. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline was suspended, and the first moves were taken to restrict imports of natural gas into Europe. By the end of 2022, imports of pipeline gas from Russia into Europe had virtually stopped, and, well, other measures were taken. And, well, as we all know, that didn't work. And then a little later, the Biden administration tried again. They tried with the price cap on Russian oil, and that didn't work. And then they attempted other things. They attempted to restrict Russia's ability to export oil, and we've had the development of the so-called shadow fleet in response to all of that. I've heard an awful lot about that shadow fleet here in Russia. I will discuss it in more detail in my next program. Well, that didn't work either. There's been various attempts to persuade other countries like China, India, those sort of countries to stop trading with Russia, and that has been unsuccessful. And what must worry the Trump administration is that the sanctions that Lindsey Graham is now proposing aren't really sanctions on Russia at all anymore. Those sanctions have been attempted and they have been essentially unsuccessful. The European Union has just passed further sanctions trying to sanction Russia's so-called shadow fleet. They believe that they've sanctioned around half of that fleet. They are, by the way, wrong about that. The shadow fleet, as it is called, is a constantly changing and evolving creature. But I'm not going to discuss that in this program. But they have essentially sanctioned everything in Russia that they can. Lindsey Graham's proposed sanctions aren't really sanctions against Russia. They are sanctions against other countries, principally India and China, which buy Russian oil. If the Russians don't come to heel, then the United States supposedly will impose sanctions on these countries or tariffs at astronomical levels of 500% plus to punish them for buying Russian oil and supposedly to deter them from doing so. Now, both the Chinese and Indian governments have over the last couple of days made statements. There's been some strong statements from India that they intend to go on buying Russian oil. So insisting on this line would appear to push the United States towards a confrontation with India and China. This at precisely the time when the United States has already increased sanctions, has increased tariffs against China, brought them up to 145% on most goods, and has realized that that is an unsustainable position, that is creating a crisis across the US and European economies, and has just negotiated with China a reduction in those tariffs. And this also at a time when relations between India and the United States are also under stress, with the Indians increasingly angry, increasingly making known their anger about America's role in allegedly brokering the end of the conflict between India and Pakistan. The Indians are now saying that, in fact, the United States didn't broker or mediate the end of anything. It was just that Pakistan came to heel. You can believe that or not. I mean, I'm not going to get into the realities of that, but that the Americans just meddled in the affair, and what they're saying about them carrying out a successful mediation exercise is simply untrue. That is what the Indians are saying, and they're making little attempt at the moment to conceal their irritation with the Americans. So, an all-out economic attack on India and China India, a country that the United States wants to win over. China, a country with which the United States has already waged a kind of economic war from which it is trying to find a way out. And this at a time when China has already blocked the export of rare earths. And I was reading just a few days ago in the Financial Times the devastating effect this is starting to have on global supply chains and on the ability of the US military industries to keep operating, because they rely on China to provide them with those rare earths, and there are no current alternatives and substitutes for them. So when Lindsey Graham is talking about massive sanctions against Russia, he really means sanctions against Russia's trading partners, and it would be disastrous for the United States, both economically and geopolitically, to enter into a direct battle with those trading partners, China and India. In the case of China, the United States is trying to retreat from an economic conflict with that country. In the case of India, it doesn't want to rupture what is already a strained relationship. So, I'm not saying that Lindsey Graham's sanctions would be without consequences and would be a pure bluff, but if imposed, it is very easy to see how instead of deterring the Russians, they would backfire catastrophically on the United States, and as Marco Rubio also says, on Ukraine as well, destroying the prospect of a negotiated peace and intensifying, strengthening Russian resolve to see this war won. So the United States has very limited options, whereas this warning that Medvedev is giving is one that Russia can absolutely see through. It can absolutely enact it. And Medvedev made the further very interesting point that seeking Ukraine's unconditional surrender is something which many people in Russia would probably want to see. There is already a current of opinion in Russia, and about that he's absolutely right, incidentally, that would actually favor that outcome over a negotiated settlement. So if Russia were to decide to pursue it, it would be going with the flow of a significant section of public opinion within Russia itself. So that is what Medvedev said at the legal forum which I have been attending. And it is a warning that I think needs to be taken seriously in the West and needs to be taken seriously in Ukraine itself. I think that this warning was not really made to the Ukrainians at all. I think Medvedev by now fully understands that the Ukrainians are not capable of negotiations, or at least Zelensky isn't, leading to any kind of satisfactory outcome. I think that this was more a warning addressed to the people who Putin and Medvedev have at various times referred to as Ukraine's curators. In other words, the Western powers, ultimately, of course, the Trump administration. And, well, I hesitate to call it an ultimatum, but it is, in effect, that when addressed to Ukraine, basically accept Russian terms at the negotiations or else. And if it is definitely an ultimatum addressed to Ukraine, it is also a very, very strong message made to the West and specifically to the United States. So that is what Medvedev said, that this is the last chance. He was absolutely explicit about this. He said it more clearly than any other Russian official has ever done up to this point. He made it clear that either Ukraine negotiates seriously and comes to terms, basically on the terms that Putin outlined at his speech to the Foreign Ministry on 14th June 2024, or the alternative is that the Russians focus on winning the war and seek Ukraine's unconditional surrender. I said a few programs ago that my impression is that the Russians are actually more focused now on the war than they are on the negotiation process. That doesn't mean that they're not taking the negotiations process seriously. As I said previously, the delegation they sent to Istanbul was a strong one, but it is the war which is now Russia's priority. And again, I'm not going to discuss the military situation in any detail in this program. Suffice to say that I was reading in TASS, our old friend Andrei Marochko, saying that the Russians are now close to encircling Konstantinovka, that they're attacking Konstantinovka from 3 directions, and that I've seen the first discussion in Russian telegram channels of how Russia might conduct the battle to capture the cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. The first serious discussions of that topic that I have seen at any time so far in this war. Well, there we are. Now, in my program yesterday, I said that I would touch on in this program today the question of Keir Starmer and why he was excluded from Donald Trump's calls. I'm afraid, because I am under such intense time pressure, I'm going to have to delay that until my next video, which is the one I will be making from London. This is where I'm afraid I'm obliged to stop, but Medvedev's warning, I think, is one that needs to be taken very seriously. And I hope that in Washington, at least, they are so taking it. Anyway, that is the end of my program today. To repeat again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Please remember that you can also, if you've liked this video, that you can check your subscription to this channel and tick the like button. Thank you again. More from me soon, next time from London. Have a very good day.